Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. This video is a debate, and the motion will be this House believes that the United Nations has failed. So, there'll be no more ado. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen of the House, this House believes that the UN has failed. Well, let's go over why it was created in 1945 by the Allies in the Second World War. They even call themselves the United Nations during the Second World War. So its charter, the preamble, says that it's here to prevent the scourge of war, which has twice in our lifetime brought untold misery to mankind. And so it has signally failed in its central mission, and that was its mission statement. It does not prevent armed conflicts. Indeed, it actually causes them in many cases. It is doing a very poor job at upholding human rights, and indeed carries out some egregious human rights abuses itself on a grand scale. It does little against famine, against disease. It doesn't do much to further education, to prevent poaching, endangered species being wiped out, not addressing climate change, disaster relief, and so on. It has had some limited success in these spheres, but overall the record has been abysmal. There's been so much corruption, huge amounts of money have vanished to the bank of nowhere. It's extraordinarily wasteful, and sexual abuse has been committed by its UN peacekeepers. So think of the structure of it. We've got the five countries, permanent members of the UN Security Council: Russia, China, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Well, France and the UK don't belong there. They're a shadow of their former selves. They're far less powerful, relatively and absolutely, than they were in 1945. Possibly even one seat for the European Union. That might be something. India ought to be there. That's long overdue. So it doesn't reflect the new nature of the power distribution. Other things is should we have a UN Security Council at all? It's wrong, some animals being more equal than others. It's preposterous that, let's say, Monaco, with a tiny population of 30,000, should have one seat in the General Assembly, the same as China, which is such a gigantic population. And the most savagely tyrannical regime in the world, whichever the one that you consider to be, has as much say as the most humane one. So if we say that North Korea doesn't deserve representation, it's not because we don't value North Korean people. We do. It's precisely because we should be so morally outraged at how they are abused by their own government, which oppresses them so very cruelly. Big nations are excluded from being Secretary General. There's this informal agreement that nobody from a country on the UN Security Council can be Secretary General, which is discriminatory. So it's undemocratic, as I pointed out, and it is not solving the problems it's supposed to solve. Then it authorizes war rather than stops it so often. You see the bombing of Libya, the overthrow of the Gaddafi government, and the bloody anarchy which still reigns in Libya to this very day. Likewise, in Iraq, it was UN Security Councils which was cited by the coalition to go into Iraq. But then when it comes to somewhere like Palestine, been illegally occupied since 1967, the UN doesn't manage to achieve anything, because in the UN Security Council, the United States always blocks the resolution. You can have virtually every country in the world voting against it, against this illegal occupation. It still goes on. The Paris deal, they can't get the United States to come on board, to join the rest of the world and actually do something to address this existential threat to our species. You see in Syria, the UN has failed to end the conflict there. Unarmed observers, peace negotiations have got us nowhere. The Rwandan genocide, and on and on. I mean, we could be here all night. So its failures are legion. There are myriad examples of that. Bosnia-Herzegovina and so on. There's even this theory that actually makes aggression more attractive, because an aggressor country knows we can go ahead and attack and maybe win. The UN will take a long time to get its act together. There'll be a lot of hand-wringing and humming and hawing, and should we do this? And will not act quickly and decisively. And remember, a stitch in time saves nine. If they solve the problem soon, then it'll be over. It'll be manageable. But if you leave it too long, then the conflict will just metastasize. The other thing, an aggressor nation knows that even if it goes wrong and they get pushed back into their own territory, by that time the UN will intervene. There'll be peacekeepers. It can be a frozen conflict. You can have a buffer zone. So people know they can commit aggression. The UN will intervene and prevent an effective counterattack. So that's why there are so many ongoing conflicts, where the one side going ahead and winning decisively, and then it's over. They've not addressed the Jammu and Kashmir conflict. They've not done anything about Azerbaijan versus Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, and on and on. So they failed in Northern Ireland. They have let down the people of Palestine. Various civil wars around the world, not dealt with ISIS or the Taliban. We could be here all night, so I shan't give examples because they're just too numerous. So often it's not the solution, but it's part of the problem. And it doesn't set its own house in order. So it's a useless talking shop at best. It's hugely expensive. It's just there to caress the egos of some world leaders and to provide these cushy jobs, sheltered employment for humanities graduates, for people of a liberal left globalist outlook. Why do we not have someone who really has left field opinions employed there? These are sinecures for certain people, for NGO types. So for all the reasons I've already outlined, I beg to propose this motion. Well, now, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I oppose this motion, and it's indecent that it's even put for many reasons. And I must express my gratitude to my colleague, the honourable member across the aisle, for including so many honking factual errors in what he said. Anyway, we can't count wars that didn't happen, all right? There could be a lot more. We've had no Third World War, which is a minor miracle. Informed observers after the Second World War thought it was a virtual certainty. So yes, there have been conflicts, but there's been no conflict since then in which over 2 million people have been killed. Considering how the world population has gone up so much, that's actually very low compared to the Second World War. And so we've had no nuclear exchanges, which again is an extraordinary success. So there's diplomatic pressure. No, there hasn't been 100% success, but jaw is better than a war, as Harold Macmillan said. And it did end the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. Okay, it wasn't able to do it immediately. It would have been a wholly worse. Jammu and Kashmir, it was often broken ceasefires. And so it could be a lot worse if it weren't for that. Likewise, has managed to keep China from attacking Taiwan, managed to try and bring about the peaceful reunification of Taiwan. Likewise, it managed to close the Korean conflict, and indeed it was a UN mission to end South Korean aggression in the first place, North Korean aggression in 1950. In Cyprus, it's ended the conflict there, and there is peace and amity between the two parts of Cyprus. They're looking at reunification. Likewise, in Colombia, it's intervened, even in an internal conflict. And in Angola and in Namibia, helped with the transition to democracy away from apartheid in Namibia, intervening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are many more examples around the world, likewise in Lebanon. Now, the Northern Ireland conflict was internal to the UK, and it occasionally spilled over into the Republic of Ireland, but the Republic of Ireland and London agreed to work together on this one, and it was actually a very small-scale conflict. I know 3,500 people were killed, but really, over the space of 35 years, that was not high. Of course, I prefer it was zero. And there are myriad more examples of this. So the UN has to be there for all. It is the United Nations. It's not just the Western nations. It's not just for the nations with a good human rights record. They don't need the UN so much. So we have to respect the sovereignty of member states, and therein is the rub. It's difficult to get cooperation from everybody, and if the UN was too intrusive, then member states would withdraw, as they did in the 1930s. And if people felt that it encroached excessively on national suzerainty, then they wouldn't be members of the UN in the first place. And that's why the UN tried to avoid the mistakes of the League of Nations, because the League of Nations was not alluring to the United States, didn't join, and didn't allow many countries to join. So the UN strives to be inclusive. We have to be realistic about the balance of power in the world, which is why the UN Security Council has the structure and composition that it does. Now, you might be right that perhaps redistributing this is long overdue, and that's an issue which is being actively looked at. But unsurprisingly, the countries that set it up to suit themselves are unwilling to cede or share the power that they hold. So we mustn't forget what life was like before the UN was formed. The League, which was ineffectual, and the UN is not toothless like the League was. We don't want the rule of great powers. You can just lord it over the less economically advanced countries, and there was constant conquest of countries which were puny. So as Obama said, there's an arc that bends towards justice, towards disseminating democracy, towards upholding human rights. And there are many UN human rights instruments like the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention Against Torture, Inhuman, Degrading and Treatment, and so on, and much progress has been made. Though, yes, there are areas of darkness in the world. We've always got to worry in case there is some sort of regression here. But all member states are paying their dues now. Even the United States has, since George W. Bush, something for which he very seldom gets credit. Literacy has spread as the world population has abounded. Despite the pullulating populace, literacy has increased. Polio has been successfully eradicated. There are vaccination programs run by the World Health Organization. The World Bank provides soft loans for the less economically developed nations of the world. So women's rights have made strides in such advances, greater advances in 1945 than in any comparable period, any period of 70-odd years throughout human history. So done so much to prevent catastrophe. Since the 1980s, there's been no large-scale famine, so much to promote the common weal. So we have to be solicitous about the welfare of our human beings, and the UN High Commission for Refugees and so on helps to do this, the World Food Programme, and on and on. So there are all sorts of aid workers who are doing what they can for penurious people. And it's mostly focused on Africa these days and cooperating with regional organizations such as the African Union. So population control, that is a difficult issue, and it's a sensitive one because the UN has to tread carefully because there's certain religious and cultural beliefs towards natalism, and the UN is reluctant to tread on people's toes. There are UN passports to deal with stateless people. There's the International Criminal Court, and it has arraigned suspected war criminals there. Those indicted there have had fair trials, and there have been verdicts there, and some people have been awarded hefty sentences, life sentences occasionally, or sometimes been acquitted. So the UN has achieved a great deal under extraordinarily challenging circumstances. So don't write it off too soon. A huge amount has been achieved. It's just really incalculable, the amount of suffering that has been relieved. But yes, new difficulties arise all the time, and there remains a long way to go. So this is a work in progress. So that's why the UN is a mature organization, and it welcomes constructive criticism. This reproof is needed. And I like the UN getting this admonition because then it's got guidance about ways to improve. Put it this way, no member state has ever left the UN or ever been expelled from it. 7 billion humans can't be wrong. Almost nobody advocates leaving it. Only a handful of isolationists in the United States advocate leaving it, and it's really not a serious proposition. So despite its shortcomings, the UN is really the best thing we've got. And has had some magnificent achievements, and I know it'll have greater achievements, but no, it's not perfect. It's sometimes suboptimal. We've got to strive to improve it. Abolishing it would hugely exacerbate the problems that mankind faces. For those reasons, I beg to oppose.